Breadbox Media programming is brought to you by... It's so much more than just a profile picture. At Catholic Singles, our platform offers you many opportunities to get to know the person behind the picture. Sign up today at CatholicSingles.com. Good News Ministries of GNM.org. It's the Catholic place for growing your faith. Good News Ministries will provide you with faith-building reflections, virtual retreats, prayer resources, and lots more. All of it is free. Visit gnm.org today.
Well, hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Lisa, Hendey, and Friends. I am really excited about this week's podcast because the subject matter is something that's very near and dear to my heart as a Californian. And the saint that we'll be discussing today is someone that is much discussed in the church, and joining us to be sort of an expert on the topic is Christian Clifford. And Christian is a veteran educator who currently teaches high school, juniors, and graduate students. He's the author of 3 books that we'll be discussing today, all about the Catholic Church history in Spanish Mexican California. And for a good time, he enjoys walking the 800-mile California Missions Trail. And believe me, that we'll be asking a lot about that today. Welcome to the show, Christian Clifford.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, wow. Well, I always have a question that I start off with, and it'll be fun to ask you this, just to tell us a little bit more about your story. So kind of how you got to where you are right now in your faith journey.
Absolutely. So I've been an educator, Catholic educator, for almost 25 years. And back in, I want to say, 2014, is that right? No, January 2015, Pope Francis announced that Junipero Serra would be recognized as a saint. And the media, the mainstream media really kind of jumped on that and presented it as a kind of an either-or proposition, Either you see him as a holy man or you see him as an evil man, which I thought was very dishonest to approach him that way. And teaching junior theology at a school named after Serra High School in San Mateo, some of my young students got really confused by that. So here I am up there talking about church history, first-person accounts, primary sources, Junipero Serra, and His Holiness. And, one young man I remember very clearly asked, well, hey, Mr. Clifford, he was very respectful. He said, Mr. Clifford, this guy wrote a book, and he's also using primary sources, and what do you think about it? Because the book is named Cross of Thorns, and he's really depicting the missionaries and the missions as concentration camps and things of that nature. So that got me thinking, if my young students at a Catholic high school are confused by this, maybe I should write a book. So it led me on a journey to do more research about Junipero Serra and using primary sources, secondary sources, and really writing it to young people, such as that student. And I just followed the historical method, something that I teach my students, and ended up writing a short 100-plus page book about Saint Junipero Serra. The subtitle is Making Sense of the History and Legacy. And I really enjoyed doing that, and it led me to a lot of new things, just like today speaking with you, which I really appreciate.
So you didn't set off initially to be an author, but your journey for truth led you to try to do that. I love that. And am I correct that you're a husband and a dad of a son? Is that right?
Yeah, he's a sixth grader.
Oh, awesome. So living in California, as both you and I do, one of the things that listeners who don't live in California might not know is that really every student in California gets acquainted with the California missions as a result of their education, even if you're not in Catholic schools. Quite often, as part of the history curriculum, students will study the missions and pay visits to the missions for field trips. And I have two sons, both of whom actually did mission projects where they actually constructed a mission as part of their schoolwork. So it's an overview, but you're right that in recent years, it's been a little bit of a rocky road because, you know, as we look back on the historical context of when St. Junipero Serra lived, it's a very different time than what we live in now. And so I think it's really great that you've added to the body of work that gives a perspective on, you know, who Father Serra was, and also the legacy that he left behind. And certainly, you know, we don't ever want to kind of whitewash anything that's challenging. But one thing that I really love about your books is that in the two that you did on Father Serra, which are very well documented. So Christian's written two books, Who Was St. Junipero Serra? And then the second one, St. Junipero Serra, Making Sense of the History and Legacy. We'll talk about the third book in a few minutes. But with these two, I can really see that you dove deep in your research and that you cite not only, you know, historical records, but also interestingly kind of detail the canonization process and have some great teachings on what it is to be a saint in the church and what Pope Francis spoke of when he created this new saint for the United States and really for our hemisphere. I'm just curious. So your own son probably has gone through some of that curriculum with studying the saint at school.
Yeah.
So he was probably the expert when it came to talking about it.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. First of all, you brought up a really good point. When I started my research for my first book, you know, I was open to the process. I mean, as a historian, you have to be. But, you know, as you're well aware, as Catholics, church history, we ask different questions from a faith perspective, that God is at work through and in people like you and me, saints and sinners trying to live out their baptismal promises. And so I was open, but it was really interesting because what I found out is what I understood about Junipero Serra before the process of writing that first book were validated from, you know, other people. So it wasn't a quest to kind of just support my own biases and perspective, but I realized, wow, the things I've learned and really turned into a great passion for seeking truth, and it's pretty spot on. But a real quick note about my son. One of the greatest things that has happened in this entire process was he, in fourth grade, as you brought up to your listeners, in California, part of the curriculum is teaching Spanish Catholic history in California to the students and their interaction with the native peoples and the Mexicans, etc. But his teacher asked me to come and speak to the class about my my passion for St. Junipero Serra. And it was my little boy who actually said, "Dad, you should write a second book for kids called Who Was St. Junipero Serra?" I don't know if you're aware of that book series, the Who Was books. And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. And it's really unique because it's through the lens of those who knew St. Junipero Serra. So I did some research on those people, mainly young people, and it is historical fiction. So I'm basing it on the historical record, but I'm doing some conjecturing in the process. But I think it's a pretty fun story, and I'm really proud of it.
It is. And that particular book, well, it's important to say, first of all, that you have a foreword from Bishop McElroy, which is the Bishop of San Diego, which is a wonderful, kind of endorsement for the work you've done in the book. But I love that it's first person, too. And I love the illustrations in the book that really kind of like enhance the voice that that you've offered to the kids as they read this. So do you find that it's being used in classes around the state now?
Not as much as I wish.
Oh, well, we have to get the word out.
I know, and I appreciate your helping me do that, because it's done okay, but not quite as well as I wished at this point. But I think it's a great tool for Catholic educators in particular, of young people to help them, because the curriculum is there's a committee done a couple of years ago, and they're, professors of history and archaeology at the public universities who are vested in this part of research, and they recommended actually getting rid of the mission project. So it's a recommendation, but I think that we're going to see a lot of schools come up with alternatives, because they argue that the educational value is not quite there. But, when I did it with my son, he had Mission Carmel, where St. Junipero Serra is buried. And we go on family pilgrimages there annually before the school year begins. I tried to help him make it as historically accurate as possible, not to sugarcoat it, kind of like what you made a reference to earlier, that we can't whitewash history. We need to be truthful about it. But the truth is that St. Junipero Serra loved the Indians. He really did. And he was a man of his time, and some of the things are peculiar to the modern mindset, even those of us of faith. But there's no doubt about it, he was a holy, holy man.
Well, a few things that you kind of highlight on the back of that particular book that tell, a little bit of a history of Father Serra, kind of in a snapshot, that he was the apostle of California, that he evangelized the West, he was the father of the missions, the first saint associated with the state of California, the first saint canonized on U.S. soil, a founding father of the United States, a patron saint of vocations, and the United States' first Hispanic saint. And I want to hear you pronounce, you're probably better at it, his motto, which I think is a real calling card for Father Serra. Can you say it in Spanish for me and then give us the translation?
Sure. I'm not a Spanish speaker, but I'll try my best. Siempre adelante, which is ever forward. So, as Catholic Christians, or Christians, all of us, all denominations, we have one foot in this life and one foot in the next. And he was always mindful of that, That, I guess, in our modern mind, it seemed a little naive, but in the cultural exchange, he was trying to build a utopian society based on Catholic beliefs, and to bring the gospel to the natives. And we all know that unintentionally, that cultural exchange brought a lot of deaths due to disease. But
that motto has been something that's been really significant to me. We're going to talk a little bit about the walk pilgrimage that you've been embarking on in a few minutes when we get into that. But I think when I've looked back at the life of Father Serra, and I understand from the beauty of being able to go worship in the missions and the remains, visiting the remains of missions, and seeing the legacy that was left behind in terms of the church presence here, and how it ties into, the presence of the architecture of this place that we live in, and kind of the social structure. It's just very interesting. And last year, our family visited Sonoma and visited one of the missions up near there. And I was just thinking about how many people now who visit some of the missions are now sort of historical museum types of places. Some have been for example, San Luis Obispo, rebuilt with beautiful, accompanying structures that sort of go along with the original missions. But to go back and to visit these places and to witness, the simplicity of the lifestyle then, and the artifacts that have been preserved, not only church artifacts, but, I'm always fascinated to see the working tools of that historical time, the writing desks that they used, or the pencils, or their clothing, or just all the things that we can look back and see that were a window into a past and a time that's so different from ours. And it always strikes me that it's a gift of the church that these things have been preserved, and that we continue to talk about the legacy that began with St. Francis of Assisi that then carried into not just California but Arizona and Texas and other parts of the country as well. So really fascinating. Really fascinating. What's one of the things that you've most taken away from the spirituality of Father Serra that's impacted your personal spirituality?
I would say that, he was born Miguel Jose Serra. He was Majorcan, which is a part of Spain today. And he took the name Junipero, which at his ordination. And I don't know if you're aware of this and your listeners, but Junipero was a very close friend of St. Francis of Assisi. He was a brother. And his name literally translates into fool for Christ. And I think that's really all of us as Christians, living in the world and believing what we believe in our vision for the world, that oftentimes the world looks at us and thinks we're fools. But we do this, we embrace it, hopefully, in our faith journey. We embrace that and we live it out. Because Junipero Serra was really tough. He was tough on himself. He lived his life in a very, he practiced flagellation, and he did say, hey, you know what? If we're going to discipline the natives, the native Christian in particular, for breaking our moral codes and mores, then the friars are to do it, because he felt that the civil authorities, if they did it, it would be too harsh on them. So he did allow for that. And, sometimes in my teaching, I think of myself as kind of maybe too tough. So he really wanted to soften a little bit his faith life, and that's why he took the name Junipero. He wanted to be less intellectual, because he was brilliant. He was a professor of theology back in Palma, Mallorca, and he had a pretty cushy life for a religious, I guess. And but he really felt a desire to go beyond his comfort zone, and that's why he came first to Mexico, and then Baja California in Mexico, and then on to the modern state of California. So these guys, the other 139 roughly friars that ministered in the modern state of California, the eventually 21 Catholic missions along the coast, these guys did that great sacrifice. And yes, you had a few bad apples who probably did it for other reasons. I don't know what, but I mean, it was basically equivalent of being on the moon. So these guys knew they would probably never return home. Particularly Junipero Serra, he knew he'd never return home to see his parents buried and his nephews and nieces married and to raise children of their own. So a great sacrifice he came here. So yeah, he's quite an amazing figure. There's always more to learn about him, and I think that's what he's taught me up to this point so far, to loosen up a little bit and to let Christ work in and through me, even though the world might ridicule that.
Well, I think it's a great lesson to look at his legacy and to look at it in the context of the history, but also to recognize that this is someone whose cause for canonization. It's not easy to become a saint in the Catholic Church.
No,
and to know that, over many, many years, when he was not yet canonized, that there were studies done, and, certainly the historical perspective was taken into account, that gives me some sense of comfort in recognizing that there were things about his spiritual life that have value to us. And so we study him in that context to understand what is it that we can take from his life, from what he taught, from what he shared, from what he lived, and work on our own path to sainthood. It's one of the things that I love about studying the lives of the saints is that they weren't perfect, that many of them were broken people. And it gives me somewhat of hope that somebody like me can learn something to move forward. An interesting offshoot of his life results in your third book, which I know it's the second book that you wrote, Meet Pablo Tac. And the subtitle of this is Indian from the Far Shores of California. And this book was published back in 2017, so I'm guessing it was your second book. But this book introduced me to someone I'd never heard of before. So who the heck is Pablo Tac, and why do we need to know about him? Or is it Tac?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it is my third book. Who Was St. Junipero Serra was traditionally published first go-around for like the first year and a half, and then I got out of the contract and self-published it.
Okay.
But anyways, let me tell you about Pablo Tac. So when I was researching for my first book, St. Junipero Serra, I forget, a Google search or, search engine search on something pertaining to Serra, and up popped a PDF, unnamed, untitled, and it said Pablo Tac writings, blah, blah, blah. And it ended up being for a ethnic studies class at UC San Diego. So some professor made it a PDF and put it there for his students, and it went live somehow. And I read it. It was the writings of Pablo Tac from Rome in the early 1840s, or maybe late 1830s, and I was blown away. Here it was, a mission Indian who went to Rome to study for the priesthood, and he wrote his writings are the earliest writings from a California Indian, not just mission Indian, California Indian. And I'm like, why haven't I heard of this guy before? I mean, I've taken California history classes, I've taught California history classes, and there's silence on this guy. And those in the know who've written, there's only been a few books written on him. I don't understand why he's not more widely known and understood, because I remember reading in the San Francisco Chronicle a letter to the editor from a professor at UC Santa Cruz who's written on Pablo Tac, and she was against the canonization of St. Junipero Serra. And I'm like, well, why doesn't she bring up Pablo Tac and how this was more than likely, this is my main argument in the book, that was the dream of St. Junipero Serra, that the Indians could finally be self-sufficient, to take basically ownership of the missions and the Catholic faith, and to have Catholic Indians be the pastors of their own people. Of course, we know that never came to fruition during his lifetime, but it was his dream. And I was pretty taken aback, so I started doing a real deep dive on his life, and I started encountering a couple of academic papers on him from a gentleman by the name of Dr. Carl Kottman, who's down in Temecula, and he's a historian of philosophy, and those really helped a lot. But he didn't live a very long life. He was at seminary for about 6 or 7 years, and unfortunately and ironically, he died of probably tuberculosis back in Rome. So right before he was ordained, but he left quite a legacy. And to achieve so much in such a short life is an amazing feat. So that's how I encountered Pablo Tac, how I met Pablo Tac.
And just a couple things about him. So I think it's important for people to know that he actually was not quite 20 when he passed away. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that his leaving for Rome happened at the age of 10, and he was in the company of his spiritual father, one of the Franciscans, Father Perry, I think.
Father Perry.
Yes.
Perry. Yeah.
And that it was, so his work and his writings happened at an extremely young age, that his intelligence, not only in learning about his faith, but also in documenting his own native language, was quite significant, and a gift, that's captured and been given. So over at your website, which is missions1769.com, you have a link to a petition that you've started to actually have the cause for canonization of Pablo Tac be considered. And that's an interesting endeavor that somebody's got to initially decide, wow, this person lived a life of great valor, and we're going to look at it.
Yeah.
So that's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think it's going to be an upward battle. I have about 300 signatures, almost half online and half in hard copy so far. I'm hoping for about 2,000. That's what the people who are supporting Black Elk, he's a Sioux Indian, he was a catechist for canonization. They got about 2,000 signatures to present to the local bishop for his cause. So, yeah, I have a ways to go, and I'm praying a lot to St. Junipero Serra and Pablo Tac that this is really achieved, if not in my lifetime and maybe my son's lifetime, because he's a name that shouldn't be forgotten.
Yes. And I think that's one of the reasons I was so fascinated to learn about him and to dive in more, because, especially for young people to recognize that you don't have to be an old person to be somebody who makes a great impact on the world around you. So interesting. I was going to say an interesting hobby of yours and an avocation, but you have another fascinating hobby that I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about, which is that it's not a hobby. It's really a pilgrimage that continues. I know you visited all the missions by car, but now you're working on walking the 800-mile California Missions Trail. And I spent way too much time today on your website, kind of virtually traveling with you and reading about all the journal entries. So tell us about what made you decide to do this and where you are on getting this done.
So last May, so not this previous May, but the one before it, my family had to go to the Philippines, and I remained behind. And I was kind of bored within 24, 48 hours after they left. And I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe this would be a good opportunity to start walking between the missions. Because I had encountered a group called the California Mission Walkers on their Facebook group, and these guys just love walking between the missions. They love the history, they love the exercise, the camaraderie. People do, and of course, plenty do it for a religious pilgrimage. And I said, I'm going to start doing this. So Friday after school, I got a couple things in a bag, and I went up to Mission Sonoma, and I started walking southbound. And little did I know that this was going to be quite a task, because I had blisters and sores, and I think it was in over my head. But I've learned a lot. Every segment, every part of the journey, I learned a lot about prayer, myself, how to take care of my physical well-being. And now I am in 31 days, I've covered 526 miles, and I visited, I think, 17 of 21 missions. So I still have about 275 miles, 280 miles left. God willing, I'll get that done.
The end is in sight. You're over halfway there. So let me ask you, because this is not like you didn't leave, on 31 days ago and you're continually walking. So you're doing segments of it. How does that work? So you go between missions?
Yeah. So I'm pretty pragmatic about it. It's like I gave a talk about my book, Meet Pablo Tac, to some students in San Diego this time last year. And I asked my wife, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll get some of the walk-in. And she said, yeah, go for it. And I walked between Mission San Diego and Mission San Luis Rey in Oceanside, where Pablo Tac was born and raised. So, yeah, I'm just kind of practical. We went down to, what was the other one? Recently, Labor Day, holiday, I said to honey, why don't you go down to Monterey and Carmel and hang out at the beach with our son, and I'll go do some of the walks. So I walked from King City north to Mission Soledad, which is about 21 miles. And that was pretty interesting, because earlier you made reference to it, the agricultural industries that were created because of the Spanish friars. I was walking through vineyards for, mile upon mile upon mile, and I'm like, hey, this came from the Spanish friars, the grapes. So we have a lot to be thankful for.
Logistically, I have to ask you, when you do this, you're not walking on a highway. How do you know where to go? That sounds weird.
Yeah. So the California Mission Walkers, a lot of people love going to the way in northern Spain, Santiago de Compostela. And some people are like, hey, we have that, in California, basically. So they kind of, it's not exactly, though. They don't have, hostels along the way and so on. So it is different. A lot of it is urban and on pavement. But a guy by the name of Butch Briery, who's with that California Mission Walkers group, he wrote a little guidebook to help people, where to stay in campgrounds or in hotels, where to eat, and, of course, maps and things like that. So, yeah, it's not quite as straight and narrow as the way in Spain, or the way of St. James, but it is quite a pilgrimage. It's gaining a lot of recognition among people to do maybe as preparation for the physical challenges of the way of St. James.
I'm very inspired, and I'm going to be looking up that Facebook group right after I get off the phone call with you. A couple of years ago, I did, I guess it was in 2017, I walked what's referred to as a Notre Dame trail, and I'm a grad of the University of Notre Dame, and a small group of us, about 30 people, retraced the steps of our founding fathers. So we walked 320 miles, covered 320 miles in 14 days, half on foot and half by bike. And so we're covering for the first week about 40 miles a day. And I'm still, I still have the plantar fasciitis to show for that. But the resulting spiritual benefits of that pilgrimage have been so great in my life. And so it's part of the reason that I love visiting your website and just seeing, not only what you experience, but also your prayer intentions for the day. So definitely, folks, run over to missions1769.com to check out that pilgrimage. And are you kind of posting on social media as you go, or is that the best place to follow?
That's the best place to follow. And if you go to a little side note, your listeners might be like, Missions 1769, what the heck's that about? Actually, this year we are commemorating the Catholic faith in California, because it was in 1769 that St. Junipero Serra in the Sacred Expedition came to San Diego and set up the first mission, San Diego. So I thought your listeners would find that interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Mission 1769, yeah. So if you go to the website, in the top right, it'll say Notes from the CMT, the California Missions Trail, and you can read my little blog entries there about the joys and the challenges of walking the California Missions Trail. Yeah.
When you show up at the different missions, like when you arrive there and you've kind of gotten to the end of your walk for the day, do you tell them what you're doing? Or, because I know you've taken a lot of pictures and all that.
Yeah. So somebody came up with this little passport book. It's kind of like the Compostela, for California. And each of the missions has the stamp for their own particular mission. And I think a lot of kids get it done, but it's fun to go in there and say, yeah, I just walked from this point to here. Can I get the stamp for the passport book? And some people are like, they could care less, and others are just like, tell me more. This is great. It's amazing that you're doing this. So it does kind of, it's a mixed bag,
Yeah, absolutely inspirational. I'm super psyched to start. I don't know if I can do the whole thing like you've done, but there's certainly lots of missions in the area that I live in down here in Southern California. So great. Well, Christian Clifford, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk with you. Do want to point people over to missions1769.com. Don't worry if you can't remember all those numbers. We'll have links in our show notes. Wherever you're listening to this, just click through and come on over to lisahendey.com, and I'll have links for all of Christian's books and the best ways to get in touch with following him and the important work that he's doing. Any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners before we let you get back to work?
Well, I really hope that there's a lot of information about St. Junipero Serra, the California missions. A lot of research has been done. So surely I wish they would read my books. They're short and sweet, and they can, it has extensive bibliographies and so on. But just to learn more about this great saint who, at great cost, brought the gospel to strangers whom he loved. He loved without even meeting them, and he loved them more once he met them. So the gospel, we can learn a lot from those who came before us, what worked, and encountering new cultures and what didn't work, and to really hopefully come to a realization that the human family can really grow because of the gospel message.
Beautiful. Well, Christian, thank you so much, and keep up the awesome work. I can't wait to see what comes next for you, and definitely good luck on the last 200 some miles that you have left to go on the walk. God bless you for that great journey and for what you've shared with us.
Thanks, Lisa.
Well, friends, that is it for this week's episode of Lisa Hendey and Friends. Do me a favor if you would, and if you've enjoyed this, just tell a friend about the podcast. Definitely come on over to breadboxmedia.com, where not only my show, but many awesome Catholic podcasts are located. And if you would just consider maybe leaving a star rating or a review at iTunes, just to help us spread the word and to help me to continue to improve on bringing you the best episodes each week that I can. So grateful for your feedback, your support, and especially your prayers for our family. God bless you and have an awesome week.
I'm Father Dwight Longenecker. I hope you've enjoyed listening to some of my podcasts here at Breadbox Media, but today I'm speaking to you about a different opportunity. In September 2020, I'll be leading a fantastic pilgrimage cruise from Rome to the Holy Land, and then on the way back, stopping at the cities of St. Paul, Ephesus, Athens, Corinth, and more. While we're at sea, I'll be lecturing on the Gospels, history or mystery. When we're on land, I'll invite you to join me as we visit all of the holy sites, celebrating Mass, worshiping together, and having a wonderful time of fellowship. If you'd like to know more about this pilgrimage cruise, go to my website, dwightlongenecker.com, go to the right sidebar, and you'll see a picture there which invites you to get more information. Go to my website, dwightlongenecker.com, right sidebar, click on the picture of the cruise ship, and you'll get all the information you need. Alternatively, you can call the company that's organizing the tour at 800-247-0017. 800-247-0017. Ask for Father Longenecker's Cruise to the Holy Land. Thanks for listening.
Jack Kane Ford. Find your next Ford Tough vehicle at caneford.com.